Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar on the importance of rangeland for milkweed and monarch butterfly conservation. My name is Laura Coates, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a few housekeeping rules to go over. For those joining online, your cameras are off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section. We will answer those at some point during the presentation. Following the presentation, we'll have a very brief survey to fill out that will take less than a minute. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. Tonight we welcome Dr. Tim Dickson, biology professor at UNO, to present with us tonight. So let's take it away. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. So I'm going to go through a bit of background about monarch butterflies and about milkweeds, and then also some research that we've done. And hopefully everybody can hear me. I don't know if there's any way to see that everything's working just fine. Okay, I'm going to assume that everybody can. And if you're not in Omaha, we're getting pouring rain here. And so I hope you're dry wherever you are. So my name, Tim Dickson. I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, spent a lot of time outside as a kid and just fell in love with the outdoors. And I started learning more and more about plants, both because of the base of the food chain, but because they tie into everything else. And so especially pollinators, as you'll see, monarchs and plants, it's hard to differentiate the two. I also was in a place where there's a ton of grazing. And so, I got to see a lot of rangeland as a kid. And so all these things will tie into the talk. And I have three different things that I think are true from what I've learned about and what I've studied. And so I'm going to go through those three. I think you'll agree with me that they're true. One is that monarch butterflies are in trouble, and that's partly due to the loss of milkweeds. A second one is there's a lot of rangeland out there, but cattle eat milkweeds on those rangeland areas. And so we'll get to that. And then finally, milkweed and by extension, monarch butterfly abundance could be higher on rangeland than it currently is. And so I'm going to go through each one of these and so tell you the story of monarchs and milkweeds. So the first thing, monarch butterflies are not doing so well. This is a picture of the area that they take up in their overwintering grounds in Mexico. I apologize, it was different on mine, and so I apologize if there's some overlap, but the units are hectares of land. So you can see on the bottom, from starting in 1994 and then going up to this past winter, there's generally a decline in how much area those monarch butterflies are taking up. And that's directly tied to how many monarch butterflies there are east of the Rockies. It's gotten bad enough that monarch butterflies have been proposed to be listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And so they are not doing well. So some things that people don't know about monarch butterflies, there are different places where they spend the winter, or a lot of people don't know. And so the main place is in Mexico. The width of these arrows is relative to how many monarchs are making these trips. And so the main place is this area in Mexico, and that is everything east of the Rocky Mountains, except for the second place in southern Florida, where some of them hang out for the winter. And then finally, there's a population west of the Rockies that hangs out on the Pacific Ocean in the winter. And so this is what they look like. There'll be areas where the entire tree is just covered in monarch butterflies. And so this area in Mexico, there's millions of them that will end up there for the winter. Some people also don't know that they're not like birds where they fly north, kind of have, you know, eggs in a new generation and then fly back south again. They actually have 4 new generations that they produce every year before going back to Mexico. And if you can see up here on this timeline, sometime in March-ish is when they tend to leave Mexico. They come up into Texas, Oklahoma, and then the southeastern United States, and they have that first batch of offspring. And so here we have Omaha on a map, and this is just moving in time from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The overwintering generation comes out of Mexico. It lays eggs in the southern United States, so this would be where the first generation is formed. And then the ones that make it to Nebraska, those aren't the ones that left Mexico. Those are the first generation that grew up in the southern United States and then headed northwards. They then lay eggs in Nebraska, northwards, and make the second generation. The third generation is then, you know, kind of the entire eastern United States. And then finally, the fourth generation, the eggs are laid, the monarchs develop, and then they go back to Mexico. And that happens in around September or so forth. And so there's a lot of generations that happen every year in monarch butterflies. And you may know that monarchs, their eggs and caterpillars only grow on milkweeds. And because of that, all those generations that are happening, they all need milkweeds in order to lay their eggs and then have the caterpillars develop into new monarch butterflies. And so monarchs really rely on milkweeds. The number of milkweeds is a limiting factor for monarch populations. That's not the only problem that they have. During their migration, they experience a lot of weather. The adults need nectar from flowers. There are other things that affect monarchs. And so I'm not saying that you know, milkweeds are the only thing that monarchs need, the only thing that we need to conserve. But pretty much everybody agrees that lack of milkweed plants is part of the problem for why monarchs are not doing so well. One of the reasons that there's not so many milkweed plants around is because we're using more herbicides, and there's also been an increase in corn, soybean cropland. And so, you know, just the number of milkweeds in this region has declined over the last 20 years. So the second thing that I think is true, or I know it's true, is there's a lot of rangeland, and I'm convinced that cattle are eating a lot of milkweeds on that rangeland. This picture right here is showing land use in the United States. The yellow is pasture / rangeland, and there's other things on here, but the brown is cropland. And so from North Dakota down to Texas, the main land uses are either cropland or the yellow rangeland, where there's large grazers. So much of the central to western USA is rangeland. It's grazed land. That's its primary land use. And if you smush all those dots together and make them go into one place, the amount of rangeland is about 1/3 of the United States. And so it's the #1 land use in the continental United States. And what you can see is most of that is cow, i.e. cattle. And so a huge amount of the United States is grazed by cattle. I'll be talking about bison a little bit more as we go on. That's in this category down here. You know, they still graze a good amount of area, but by far cattle are the main grazer on rangeland. So a huge percentage of the United States, the land use, at least, you know, any money making from the land is from grazing cattle. So the other main land use, from North Dakota down to Texas, cropland, pretty much gets rid of milkweeds. So, you know, there's herbicides that are used. Milkweeds are considered, you know, a pest in croplands. And so they're basically gotten rid of with herbicides because they're competing against whichever crop is being grown. However, on rangelands, there are milkweeds. And so monarch butterflies are really relying on rangeland for the milkweeds that are present on that rangeland. But milkweeds are toxic to cattle, right? So usually people think that it's toxic, especially if you've ever taken a biology course. You know, anytime they talk about milkweeds, they say, you know, it's toxic. It is, but the milkweeds around here are toxic like nutmeg is toxic to humans. And so livestock like cattle would need to eat only common or showy milkweeds, the two most common milkweeds in the Omaha, you know, and within hundreds of miles of here. They needed 100% of common or showy milkweeds for an entire 24 hours to exhibit sickness from that milkweed. So they can handle a pretty good amount of milkweeds. Similarly, a person would need to eat about 4 entire pumpkin pies to feel the effects of nutmeg. And they need to eat about 20 entire pumpkin pies in a 24-hour period to be in danger from nutmeg. Nutmeg is toxic, but at very high levels. And I think, and there's good evidence to back this up, that almost all the milkweed species in this region are toxic, but fairly mildly toxic. They would need to have huge amounts of them be eaten to really, you know, threaten cattle. All right, so I've got a little video here. It's actually not going to play on here due to some technical issues. I'm going to share a screen just so I can show this. So bear with me for one moment. So hopefully you're all seeing this. And here is a bison. There's a milkweed right here. And we'll watch and see what it does. No problem. Goes on with its day, no reaction whatsoever. And then I'm going to switch to my other video. There's a milkweed right in the middle of it. Make this larger on our screen at least. So it's right here. So it comes along, it eats through it, and it goes on with its day. And so we actually have a whole bunch of trail camera images of cattle and bison both eating milkweeds. And that's the standard reaction. They eat it, and then they move on with their day, no reaction. And so we've got a bunch of evidence that cattle and bison are eating milkweeds. And as long as it's not a huge part of their diet, we have no instances where it's caused any noticeable health problems. So for my third thing that I've seen and that I think is true, milkweed and monarch abundance could be higher on rangeland. And I just want to acknowledge some master's students that I've advised. So John was the one that took the videos that I just showed and a bunch of other ones. And then Grace Thomas collected data that I'm about to show. So we've got evidence that cattle and bison are eating a lot of milkweed. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. I'll come to that at the end, but it's pretty clear to us that they're eating a lot of milkweed. And the question is, how much higher would milkweed be if those cattle and bison weren't eating that milkweed? And to do that, we looked at 6 different sites. And so they're all shown on a map here. And at each one of these 6 sites, we had fields that were close to each other, sometimes adjacent to each other, that were grazed by cattle, different fields that were grazed by bison, and then different fields that were ungrazed. And so at each of these sites, we compared between ungrazed and then grazed by cattle or grazed by bison. And all of these had been grazed for at least 6 years or had been ungrazed for at least 6 years. So long-term absence of grazing or presence of grazing. This is what we found for milkweeds. I'll show you the details and then the big picture. Down here, we've got all the sites that are ungrazed, and then we have the bison grazed sites, and then the cattle grazed sites. And then each of these lines are showing the different locations. So there were 6 locations that were up there. 5 of them are here, and you can see the change. This one here is broken cattle from ungrazed down to bison grazed, down to cattle grazed. So they basically all declined from ungrazed to grazed by cattle, or they all did, except for this Niobrara site in red. I'll show you that here in a little bit, why we think that is different. And so the upshot of all this is if you take all these ungrazed sites relative to the cattle grazed sites, there's about 6 times as much milkweed abundance in the ungrazed sites as the cattle grazed sites. And so we take that as evidence that likely grazing is decreasing milkweed abundance. And then similarly, there's a relationship between the number of monarch eggs that are present and whether sites are ungrazed, bison grazed, or cattle grazed. And so the same sites here, and what you can see is the ungrazed sites are generally higher, sometimes quite a lot higher than the cattle grazed sites and the bison grazed sites. And so on average, about 5 times higher monarch egg abundance in the ungrazed sites than in the cattle grazed sites. Some other graphs that I'm not going to show. This is a published study. We actually followed individual milkweed plants and then individual clumps of grass throughout the season to just see kind of when they got grazed and the percentage of them that got grazed. And overall, what we found from that is that cattle were grazing the milkweeds at about the same rate as the surrounding grasses. And so if you're wondering how much cattle seem to be grazing milkweeds, they don't seem to be really differentiating it from any other forage option that's out there. They're just grazing at the same amount as they're grazing the surrounding grasses. And so, if you've got a bunch of cattle out there, then there's a lot of milkweed grazing that's happening. And I also want to acknowledge here that co-authors, so Brittany Poinier, another master's student that I advised, and then Chris Helzer, who works with Nature Conservancy and came in on the project. as an advisor, not someone I've obviously advised. So I hope I've convinced you this is all true. You know, it seems from you know, the first thing that there's good evidence out there that that's true. The second point, some of it is evidence from outside, some of it's stuff that we've collected, and then the third one is mostly what we've collected. It all seems to be true statements for these three things, and the, you know, what I'm showing is the evidence that we have for these three things. And so we think there's a few implications that come out of those three things. The first one is something that will occasionally seem a little bit surprising, but that continuing to graze rangeland is good for monarch butterflies and milkweeds, because at least in this region, if you're not grazing land, it's usually converted to corn and soybeans pretty quickly. And so just since 2016, there's been a 17% increase in US corn acreage. That is an increase that is greater than the size of Massachusetts. It's greater than the size of Maryland. It's just a huge area of land that has been converted from grassland to corn acreage. And so in this region, that's kind of at the boundary between the Corn Belt and rangeland, when things get converted, there's no more milkweeds pretty much. And so, you know, keeping that land grazed is of benefit to milkweeds and to monarchs. The second one is that the milkweeds that we found, or the fields that we were looking at, are less than 1% of available forage. So, you know, there's a good amount of milkweeds, but if you look at how much they weigh, you know, versus all the grass and everything else, milkweeds are just, you know, 1% or less of available forage. And the sites that we looked at were mostly conservation organizations that then, you know, graze to manage grasslands, and they don't spray herbicides. So they're not managing, or they don't spray milkweeds. They're not trying to prevent milkweeds from being there. And so, so the cattle are grazing those milkweeds, and we never exhibited or saw any issues with cattle exhibiting any sickness. So we've got documented on video and also by, you know, marking milkweeds and following them, that cattle are eating these milkweeds. No, you know, no instance where the people managing the herds reported that there were health effects from that. So we take that to mean that if milkweeds are not a large amount of forage, they don't need to be controlled. They're not a problem for cattle. And so the easiest way to increase milkweed on rangeland is to stop targeting milkweeds with herbicides. This is a somewhat common practice because there's a lot of people out there that think that milkweeds are harmful to livestock. And the main ones in the Omaha area, you know, we've documented that cattle and bison are eating them, and we haven't seen any problems from it. So it appears that spraying herbicide on those species is a waste of time and money. And the easiest way to increase milkweeds on rangeland is to stop spraying those species. It saves, you know, the money, you know, that you would need to spray and to go out there and do it. And it doesn't seem to be harmful to cattle. And it's then habitat for monarch butterflies. So that's the easiest win that we think comes out of this. The last thing is this one site that there was higher milkweed abundance was different than all the other sites. We didn't realize that going in, but they don't put the cattle onto that site until August. So it's sort of like a reserve forage site. They graze down their other areas and then they move the herd over to there in August. And then the cattle start grazing, the forage down. So by the time August comes around, common milkweed, sand milkweed, a lot of different species have, they've flowered. They've pretty much finished creating seeds. And so we think that grazing consistently late in the season may not harm milkweed that much. And we're currently studying whether it would be possible, to keep a subset of land where it just gets grazed late every year. So, it's still grazed, it's still providing forage from the herd, but for that land, we're hypothesizing that you can keep a decent milkweed density and keep on grazing it. And so we're actively studying this. Hopefully, in a year or two, we'll have a pretty good answer on this. But we're wondering if ranchers that were interested in conserving monarchs, if they could take, some portion of their land and have that be the part that every year gets grazed August or after. We're wondering if that could also be good milkweed and monarch habitat. And so that's another thing that we're looking at. So that's what I have. I want to acknowledge some people. One of them is actually sitting here. So Peyton helped collect some of this data. There have also been other undergraduates that have helped to collect data, and they are showing up here. The graduate students that I showed before have collected data as well. And so there's a whole bunch of people that are involved in this. So when I say we, it is, a whole bunch of people and then me as well. I want to also thank people that have provided comments as we've thought through what all this means and thought through how to look at different things. So we've gotten a lot of help on that as well. And then I'd like to thank the people on the bottom for funding, the groups on the bottom for funding. They've all provided money that's gone into collecting data or videos that I've shown. And then the last one is the National Science Foundation. So the little insignia on the bottom right of the screen, the NSF. They didn't provide money to collect this data, but they provided money to me as I was going through training, learning how to do all this stuff as I was a graduate student and beyond. And I think people sometimes forget that funding agencies that are helping to fund science, it's not just the project that they're funding, it's also supporting a whole bunch of people. And so, up here we've got a bunch of people. Some of them will continue on and will, be the scientists of, a year, a decade, 2 decades from now. And so that funding, really helps to get this stuff done. So that's what I have. Thank you. And if there's any questions in the chat, I'm happy to answer them.
Well, thank you for your presentation. It was excellent, and the research is very important for conserving monarchs. I'm going to go ahead and launch the survey here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Thank you everyone for attending. And thank you for taking time to fill out the surveys. So why did you study milkweeds and monarchs?
Yeah. So Chris Helzer from the Nature Conservancy, he has a family ranch. And he noted that they had an area where they would put cattle in like in July, and milkweeds were fairly big. And he noted that they would just come along and eat the leaves on the plants. And so like he even has pictures of just like, just like mouth bites out of leaves. And so he said, it seems like this, might be interesting to look at. We talked about different ways to do that. We came up with other ideas on like, oh, we could look at this, we could look at that. And so essentially collaborating between Chris Helzer and myself, we started looking at milkweeds on rangeland. And that's where it started. And we might have done it even without monarch butterflies, but because we knew that they were so important to monarch butterflies, that made us especially interested in looking at that as well.
I see someone asked, what might you propose to inform ranchers of the results of your study?
Yeah, so I've tried to go to some conferences and talk with ranchers. And so, there's been some back and forth that way. I think potentially doing an extension publication of this is a good thing to do. And then ultimately what I'd like to do is have some demonstration areas. And so if we find that, having an area that grazing doesn't occur up until August, we can kind of show this works. It doesn't affect cattle weight gain. It works well, to then be able to invite ranchers in to see it. Because I think that's oftentimes the thing that really convinces people, when they can actually see, hey, this is happening and it's working. So it's not just an idea that an academic has and is studied, but it's something where, this has happened and it appears to be working. But it's, I'll also say it's a tough sell, because, I think people would need to see it in action. Because I think from a ranching perspective, there's always that little bit of a worry in the back of their mind of like, well, but, what if, milkweed density is too high here? And we don't think that's an issue. The videos we have of cattle eating them, they don't even react. But I think it's going to eventually need to be, seeing demonstrations of like, this is being done, it's working just fine. I think that's ultimately what's going to be necessary.
Thank you for presenting, and if we don't have any more questions, I'll end the webinar. Thank you everybody for attending, and have a good evening.